Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. Now this video is going to be an update on the Shameless cloner hypothetical $100,000 portfolio that I set up late in 2021 and have been tracking over the past few months on the channel. Now, if you're not familiar already, basically this series is inspired by a couple of things. Firstly, a paper that came out of the University of Nevada called Imitation is the Sincerest Form of Flattery, which basically just showed if you had simply taken the publicly available data on what Warren Buffett had been doing in terms of the stocks he'd been buying and selling, and you'd shamelessly cloned those investments in your own portfolio, that paper showed that you would have done very well. And I wanted to kind of put that into practice with my own sort of model portfolio, tracking it using ShareSite here on the channel, and kind of also walk you through my thought process in terms of bringing new companies into the portfolio or kicking older companies out as we get new kind of 13F quarterly information from some of my favorite super investors. Now, the second sort of person that this is inspired by is Jason over at the After Dinner Investor. If you haven't seen it already, definitely go check out Jason's podcast, and he also has a YouTube channel now, and he is occasionally a guest actually on the Punch Card Investing channel. So Jason has been a practitioner of shameless cloning, I would say, for a little while now, and many of the rules that we use in this series to add new stocks into the portfolio or kick them out and that sort of thing, many of the rules that I use are inspired by Jason's practices as a shameless cloner. So just last week we had a new batch of 13F filings from some of my favorite investors over in the US, and it's time to basically review some of my kind of Mount Rushmore of super investors and see whether there are any changes in their portfolios that warrant cloning in the Shameless Cloner portfolio. Now, before we get into that, just a quick reminder of kind of the rules and process around actually doing this portfolio, because although there is definitely some influence from me here, as you will see in terms of position sizing, I do want to make it as mechanical as I possibly can. Cloning 13Fs is not a perfect exercise. Like, there are stocks that you sort of smaller positions, there are stocks that are larger positions that these investors put in their portfolio. Sometimes they might buy a massive stake, sometimes they might just add a little bit, sometimes they might just sell a little bit, sometimes they might dump it all together. And we've even got examples this quarter where with one particular stock, a super investor is buying it and then another super investor is selling it. So there's definitely a little bit of art involved here, but I've tried to make it as structured as I possibly can in terms of some rigid rules. So if you want to just jump straight forward to the actual portfolio update, there will be timestamps along the bottom here. But firstly, a brief refresher just on how I'm approaching this portfolio. So the first thing I've done is I set up my Mount Rushmore of super investors. So for me, this is 6 kind of main super investors that will inspire the cloning for this particular portfolio. Most of them are really obvious ones if you follow the channel for a long period of time. Those are Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway, Charlie Munger through the Daily Journal Corporation, Monish Pabrai, Guy Spear, Lee Liu at Himalaya Capital, and also Norbert Liu at Punch Card Capital, or Punch Card Management, I think it's called. So those are my 6 sort of super investors. I've also said in the past that I'm not completely kind of closed off to cloning other super investors. We did do that last quarter because there were really no clone-worthy moves on our Mount Rushmore. We still had a portion of the portfolio sitting in cash, so I went out to sort of my broader network of super investors. In that last quarterly update, the super investor we chose was Cliff Sosin, and we cloned one of his new picks from last quarter, which was HGV. And a couple of final rules. So we do want to be somewhat price sensitive here. We don't want to pay more than 30% above the midpoint price that that stock traded for on the quarter in which an investor purchased it. So just as an example, if a stock traded somewhere between 90 and 110, that would make the midpoint 100. So we don't want to pay more than 130. So we're giving ourselves sort of 30% leeway from that midpoint in price. And in terms of position sizing, so I want to have no less than 5 stocks in the portfolio. I don't want to be more concentrated than that. And I don't want to be more diversified than 10 stocks. So as we progress through this and we get more stock ideas, we may have to do a little bit of rebalancing, but that's kind of the rough guidelines that I'm starting with. and whether it's sort of a full position or a half position is kind of based on two things. Firstly, the conviction of the super investor themselves, how big a position is it in the super investor portfolio, and secondly, this is sort of where I'm starting to add in some of my personal knowledge of the situation as well. If I'm kind of familiar with the investment case, I'm going to be more likely to bump it to a full position versus just a half position if I have kind of no idea what's going on with that particular investment. But even if I have no idea about what's going on with a particular position, this is the Shameless cloner portfolio, so I will be shamelessly cloning it nonetheless. Now, if you would like to see me go through the full 13F filings of all of the 6 super investors that I mentioned earlier, I think with the exception of Norbert Liu, I didn't cover that in my 13F video, but traditionally Norbert Liu does not have much portfolio activity, and this quarter was no exception. He made no changes, still owns 3 US stocks, which is Ally Financial, Berkshire Hathaway, and Winnebago, so nothing too much to kind of write home about in terms of portfolio activity from Norbert Liu. But if you want to see my full sort of 13F review of the other 5 investors on my Mount Rushmore, just go back a couple of videos on the channel and check out the February 2022 Guru portfolio video. But for now, let's jump in and have a look at the actual portfolio, and I will talk you through the 2 changes that I have recently made. Okay, so we are over in ShareSite now so that I can walk you through some of the recent moves that I've made in the Shameless cloner portfolio, and also talk you through some of the performance that we're seeing in the portfolio as well. Now, ShareSite is the tool that I personally use for my personal portfolio, as well as this model kind of Shameless cloner portfolio. If you want to check out ShareSite for yourself, there will be a link in the description which will get you 4 months free off of an annual subscription. ShareSite is fantastic. As you'll see, it tracks capital gains, dividend income, currency fluctuations, and gives us several reports on portfolio performance, and in my situation it integrates with the brokers that I use, so it automatically kind of pulls through the real trades that I'm making in my actual portfolios as well. So let's have a look at performance first. Now, I have got this set up to show us the performance of the portfolio since our first purchase, which in this case was the 17th of October 2021. Again, it's only February 2022 now, so a very short period of time. We will hope to track this portfolio over many years, is what I'm really hoping to do on the channel here. So wouldn't read too much into short-term performance, but nonetheless, we are currently sitting at a negative 4.57% return in the Shameless cloner portfolio versus a negative 2.24% return on the S&P 500. Now, again, that's over a fairly short period of time. We had a really rough start actually to the Shameless cloner performance. You'll see the gap got fairly wide here towards the end of December, really driven by a decline in Alibaba kind of through that time, which was or still is kind of a big position in the portfolio. The gap's closed more recently, so if I went up and changed the date range here to in this calendar year, that will actually change the performance a little bit. So Shameless cloner portfolio is now ahead, so we're down 1% versus down about 8.5% on the S&P 500. So interesting to track kind of what the performance is looking like, but not reading too much into that one just yet. So let's keep moving along and have a look at some of the holdings in the portfolio. And you may notice a couple of new stocks sitting in here. Okay, now in terms of the positions in the portfolio, let's just work down top to bottom. So Berkshire Hathaway has been in the portfolio pretty much since the beginning. That was a full 20% position, so it's got approximately a $20,000 cost basis on that position. It's up about 10 or 11% since adding it to the portfolio, and that one, in terms of the Shameless cloning portion, was a little bit different to the traditional clones in here. So it's in the portfolio of many of the super investors that I follow. Lee Liu has it, Norbert Liu has it, Guy Spear has it, and Berkshire themselves have actually been buying back a lot of shares recently. So it was a kind of a clone of a combination of people there. Guy Spear and Norbert Liu, we certainly did not meet the 30% price threshold rule because they've owned it for a very long time. But Berkshire, I mean, it's the biggest investment they've actually ever made, as far as I understand it. They've got a bigger cost basis. in Berkshire Hathaway buybacks in the last couple of years than they do in Apple. So really significant move there for Buffett, and that's kind of where that clone has come from. Now, next on the list is actually the first new position, and that is in Facebook or Meta platforms, and that is a full position in the portfolio. So with the previous update, we still had about $29,000 or $30,000 in cash, or in a Vanguard short-term ETF, which you'll see down the bottom of the list here in the portfolio, has now been drawn right down to zero, so we're fully invested now, and about 2/3 of that cash has gone to Meta. Now, if you follow us closely on the Punch Card Investing channel, you'll know that we recently did an episode on Meta and actually voted against adding it to the Punch Card portfolio. That portfolio is certainly a little more discretionary, and I actually voted no in terms of adding it to that portfolio. But in this portfolio, I'm really trying to be as shameless of a cloner as I possibly can, and I'm just basically trying to follow the rules that I've set out for myself in terms of cloning and adding new positions to the portfolio. So if I go into Facebook here, this is actually a clone of Lilu at Himalaya Capital. So if I go down to my trades and open this one up, you'll see I've cloned Lilu, and I will put up a screenshot of his 13F filing here. Lilu has recently added very significantly to Facebook. It also looks like Lilu has a cost basis in Facebook of about $270 or $280 per share, and Facebook is actually trading at a significant discount to that price now. So that is a clone of Lilu. It was a big investment for Lilu at Himalaya Capital. I'm fairly familiar with the investment situation there at Meta Platforms as well, so I think that kind of warrants a full position, and we've put that on, we've added that into the portfolio. If we keep working down the list, we've covered Berkshire, we've covered Meta. Next we have Alibaba, so that was a full position in the portfolio last time around. That was a clone of a few people, so Charlie Munger, Guy Spear, and also Monish Pabrai. Now, in terms of 13F updates, Charlie Munger has doubled his position, Guy Spear has done nothing, and Monish Pabrai has actually finished selling his position. So, fairly neutral move overall. I would argue that the doubling down by Munger is potentially a stronger move than Pabrai selling. He said in interviews and things he's basically rolling that money into Process. So no change in Alibaba, no change in DJCo. The Daily Journal is a clone of Guy Spear as well as Matt Peterson. Matt Peterson is not on our Mount Rushmore of super investors, but it did come through as a small position for Guy Spear, and it has got kind of a half position in the portfolio. HGV I've already talked about. That is a clone of Cliff Sosin, again a half position from last quarter. And next up we have Chevron Corporation, which is actually our second new stock for the portfolio this quarter. So that is a clone of Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway. In his top, I think it was 8 positions, there was no change for Berkshire, but the next one after that on the list was Chevron. And Buffett added fairly significantly to Chevron in the last quarter. Now, in terms of price, this one actually only just met our 30% price rule. The average price in the fourth quarter of 2021 seems to be about $107 per share, and we've paid $133 per share for Chevron. So we've kind of just snuck under that 30% threshold, and again, smaller position for Berkshire in the grand scheme, relative to Apple and Bank of America and American Express and everything. And I'm not familiar at all with the investment case at Chevron. So that one warrants a half position, but it is a new one in the portfolio. And finally, we have Process. So that is a clone, again, of Monish Pabrai and Guy Spear. I'm reasonably familiar with the investment thesis on that one, but it is a little harder to track. So it doesn't show up in a traditional kind of 13F filing. I mentioned last video, we'll have to follow that one fairly closely in terms of what they say in interviews and things for if they ever kind of unwind that particular position. But again, half position in the portfolio, and it is down a little since we added it. And you'll see the very last position here is just a Vanguard short-term treasury ETF. So that was just where we had basically short-term money, effectively cash sitting before we got it fully invested. So that is where the portfolio currently sits. If I go up to some of the reports here in ShareSite, let's have a look at the diversity report. That will just give us a feel for what the current allocations look like in the portfolio. And here we have it. So our biggest position is Berkshire, followed by Facebook or Meta, Alibaba, Daily Journal, HGV, Chevron, and Process. And just one other very quick note on the portfolio here. One of the things that I've said in previous Shameless Cloner updates around the share count that I have for each of these stocks, I've said that the one kind of slightly irrational rule that I have is rounding off some of the number of shares that I'm purchasing. So that may actually lead to a slightly higher than 10% or 20% allocation, or slightly lower than 10 or 20% allocation, just depending on how the stocks work out. I really enjoy seeing those very clean share count numbers in the portfolio, and it pains me to do this for this quarter, but we did have kind of an unusual, like, odd number of dollars left in our cash position and our short-term treasury bond kind of ETF, and I've made the decision to try and be as accurate as possible in terms of getting that exact number of dollars out of cash and into our two new stocks. So unfortunately, there are some fairly obscure looking share counts for our two new stocks, being Meta and Chevron. And it was really painful to put that into share size. But I just thought I would note that that's kind of the reason why you see some funky numbers in our number of shares there. So I'm assuming, I guess, for this portfolio that we're using some sort of broker that allows us to buy these fractional shares. Okay, so that is where the current portfolio sits. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking through some other stocks where there was movement in the Mount Rushmore kind of super investor 13Fs that I follow, and just kind of talk through some of the reasons why it wasn't added to the portfolio. So we've already talked through Chevron, we've already talked through Alibaba, and of course Facebook or Meta. Those are kind of the big three that where I kind of saw moves. There were a couple of other stocks where there were purchases that were kind of candidates to potentially get added to the super investor portfolio. The first one is Micron. So we already see Micron in a number of super investor portfolios. We have it in there for Li Lu, Guy Spear, and Mohnish Pabrai. And we actually saw Mohnish Pabrai buy a little bit of Micron, but I made the call not to add it to the portfolio because it was a relatively minor addition. It was only a 15% increase in shares, and it was done at quite a bit higher prices than he's bought it at in the past, and that also Guy Spear and Li Lu bought it at. So I chose to pass on that one for those reasons. I just didn't quite think it met the thresholds to warrant cloning that investment. And the final one where potentially there was some activity worth possibly cloning was in Bank of America. So that was bought by Li Lu at Himalaya Capital. It's actually a slightly bigger position than his Meta or Facebook investment, but very similar to the Pabrai Micron situation. So it was a relatively small add compared to the overall position in Bank of America, and it was also at substantially higher prices than Li Lu's cost basis. So again, for that reason, I don't think it quite met the threshold to add it into the portfolio here. Okay, so there you have it. That is our Shameless Cloner portfolio update in terms of the performance and the short time that it has been running, and also the stocks that we kind of have in the portfolio as well. So we're now at a point where the portfolio is basically fully invested, which is where it's going to get quite interesting. We no longer have that cash drag kind of sitting in the portfolio, which has actually been quite a positive for when markets have been down recently, but longer term it's likely to kind of hold the portfolio back. So I am pleased to kind of get the portfolio fully invested, but it will make for some interesting decisions in the next coming quarters with potentially adding in new stocks. So we may have to do a little bit of rebalancing and possibly pull some money away from those 20% positions to reallocate to new stocks to, you know, build out a full kind of 10 stock portfolio over time. And I'll be sure to kind of walk you through my thought process as I go about making those changes over the coming quarters. So I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit like and also subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Like I mentioned, if you're wondering the tool that I'm using to track this model portfolio over time, that is ShareSite, and it is genuinely fantastic. It saves me a lot of headaches. It takes time and helps me understand the true performance of my portfolios. So if you want to check that out, 4 months free off an annual subscription. There's a link down in the description for this video, and I should actually mention there's also a free version which you can use forever if you have less than 10 holdings as well. So that's it from me for this one, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.